All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 22, Age of Empire, American Foreign Policy, 1890 to 1914. We'll be looking at Section 1 here, Turner, Mahan, and the Roots of Empire. So thus far we've been focusing, and this was covered in some of the previous chapters, in a time period known as the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age stretches, roughly from, we might say 1870 to about, we'll say 1914, just to use this date right here. And this was what was going on mostly, domestically. We talked about how the United States transformed itself from kind of a minor power into a major military power of the world, a major economic power of the world, that a lot had gone on specifically in this time period at home. But now we're going to look at what the United States is doing in terms of foreign policy. So there is some overlap with some of the domestic things, right? Again, domestic being at home in the US, events going on while, these events are transpiring overseas. So one connection that we can make from the domestic to the foreign is this idea of manifest destiny, which had more or less stated that the US was destined to stretch from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific. Manifest destiny is related to the West, right? This was the idea that the United States would stretch across the entire North American continent. Well, this desire to spread, here in the West, and typically we're talking about, maybe places like California, New Mexico, we might add, states like, I don't know, Nevada also in this. This idea of the United States being destined to spread and all the motivations that went behind it, you can just kind of take that and extend that overseas. And one good way of maybe thinking about American foreign policy during the Gilded Age is that in some respects it's just a continuation of what's already been going on in the United States in the Western territories, that rather than California, Nevada, or Idaho being the frontier, so to speak, the new frontier becomes places like Cuba, Hawaii, and other territories that are beyond just the continental United States. And so some of these policies actually date back prior to the Civil War, but we'll be focusing more so on the ones from the Civil War onward. William Seward, he was the Secretary of State in the 1860s. So this was during the Civil War under President Lincoln and afterwards. And he was one of the early pioneers, maybe the early architects. So he's a early, we'll call him architect, however you spell architect, of U.S. empire. And empire is the desire to acquire overseas territories. And some of the ways that he sought to spread America's influence overseas was specifically targeting places like Asia and Latin America. He was responsible for acquiring the Midway Islands, which are located in the Pacific Ocean. But perhaps his most well-known and greatest accomplishment was purchasing the Alaskan territory. This was purchased by the U.S. from Russia. So this was territory that had previously been claimed by Russia. Alaska, if you're not familiar, is in the Western Hemisphere. And one of the reasons why William Seward wanted to purchase this territory from Russia was to get rid of Russian influence. At the time, Seward was criticized for this, Seward's folly, as it was called. So this was Seward's, we might call it poor decision to buy Alaska. And that was, at the time, a lot of people criticized Seward for not making a good deal. In the long run, it actually turned out to be a fantastic deal for the United States because Alaska was much richer in resources, especially, later gold rushes, right? So gold, oil, and other valuable natural resources were eventually found in Alaska. But at the time, it was heavily criticized, right? Heavily criticized. Hamilton Fish was another, I believe he was Secretary of State, maybe not directly after William Seward, but a little bit later. And one of the things that Fish was really trying to do or work to do in terms of America's influence overseas was to negotiate, and this is what the Alabama claims are, negotiate compensation for Great Britain, support of the Confederacy. Right, so during the Civil War, the British had allowed the Confederacy, the group of states that sought to break away from the Union, allowed the Confederacy to build a number of naval vessels and naval ships in British ports. And the United States wanted to seek some sort of redress. They essentially wanted Great Britain to pay the United States for that. This was much more about, you might say, this was much more about gaining international respect from the British. Again, this is still pretty early 1870s, 1880s. The United States hasn't quite emerged as a major industrial power, and other nations don't quite respect the United States like they will on the eve of World War I. The United States did get some money back from Great Britain, but not the entire amount that was demanded. Now, even though you had some of these early efforts to expand American influence by Seward and Fish, it really doesn't get started until you start seeing the major economic changes taking place in the Gilded Age. Now, recall Gilded Age. You know, this was the height, or not really the height, but you had a dramatic increase in material production. Right, sometimes called the Machine Age. You can think about Rockefeller's oil company, Carnegie's steel company, the railroad boom, and the effect that the railroads had on pretty much every single other industry. That in terms of production, the Gilded Age experienced a very rapid change in producing a lot. And that translated overseas because as much as Carnegie wanted to sell steel inside the US, Carnegie also wanted to sell steel outside the US. And so this economic pressure, right, whether it is to find international markets, which is essentially people to sell stuff to, right, or raw materials, which of course are the resources needed to produce, that this desire to sell stuff and to find valuable resources extended overseas. And this was, of course, in part due to much of the economic change that was taking place at that time. I don't usually like to talk a lot about statistics, but just to give you an idea about U.S. trade and how it was affected in these years. In 1865, the United States exported $234 million worth of goods. By 1898, which is roughly 30 years later, within a person's lifetime, the United States was now exporting $1.3 billion worth of goods. And so all of this increase, so this is an increase in U.S. economic activity overseas, also led to a lot of desires or need for, political. So for example, if you're going to do business in China, you need some people who can deal with the Chinese government. It leads to, in some sense, cultural. If you're going to do business in Western Africa, you need people in the United States who can speak that language. Or if you're going to do business in Germany, you need people who can speak German. And also military. You can imagine you're shipping $1.3 billion worth of goods around the world. You need more protection. You need a bigger Navy. You need a stronger Navy. You need a Navy that can be in Germany, be in China, be in India all at the same time. And so, even though there are a lot of different reasons as to why the U.S. expands overseas, and there's a lot of motives behind it, one major driving motive is the economics of it, right? The trade. And so just to talk about some of the other motives, of course, there were religious motives or cultural motives. You had missionary societies that wanted to spread Christianity. You had other social and cultural motives related to social Darwinism. This was, this social Darwinism, we covered it in a previous chapter. This was Herbert Spencer's take on Darwinism applied to societies. This was the idea of the survival of the fittest. And what it really helped to do was to justify overseas expansion and at the same time exploitation. More or less what social Darwinism stated was that there were some societies that were the most fit. Those were the industrial societies, and there were some societies that weren't. And so, if the United States were to go out and conquer a society that it deemed quote unquote less fit, at the time being less technologically advanced, it was perfectly justified in doing so because that's the way that Darwinism works, right? It's survival of the fittest, sink or swim, whatever it ends up being. These ideas related to social Darwinism were very, very closely related to racial science and ideas about racial superiority. Ideas about racial superiority and white supremacy served as a reason as to why the United States was right and justified in going out and conquering non-white nations. This was probably best expressed in the poem by Rudyard Kipling called The White Man's Burden, which essentially was a poem written by Kipling, who was British. Great Britain at the time was kind of the gold standard of imperialism, right? So of Great Britain, it was said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. And pretty much what that meant was that at any given moment, because the British Empire had more or less conquered the world, that there was sun shining on some portion of that empire. Now, the United States had not built an empire that was as big as Great Britain, and the United States was a little bit late to the game when it came to taking over and conquering overseas territories. But, the British were encouraging, specifically Rudyard Kipling, to follow the British model. And the white man's burden is essentially the burden to uplift uncivilized people, right? That, in other words, by going out and expanding your territory by exploiting other populations, according to Rudyard Kipling and according to the white man's burden, you are doing a service. You're doing something good for those people. It's not easy. You may not want to do it, but you're doing the right thing. Again, all of these things help essentially to justify this. This is also tied very closely to an ideology known as paternalism, which kind of ties into all these points. Paternalism is the idea of looking after one's best interests, right? And specifically, this would be of conquered people. So this was the belief that, in this case, the United States was doing the right thing by going out and conquering other people because they were bringing civilization and technology and everything else that was supposedly good there. It should also be noted that paternalism was also the same ideology that a lot of Southern slave owners used prior to the Civil War, the idea being that slave owners were looking after the best interests of their slaves, where that wasn't, in fact, the actual case. It only served as a justification for it. So again, economics, religious, and social or cultural interests, pretty much paved the way or outlined the type of motives that the United States has to go out and seek overseas territories. And so on the political front, there were a couple of ideas that were very important in kind of paving the way for an explosion of American activity overseas. Turner, Mahan, and the Plan for Empire. Turner and Mahan are two individuals. However, we should say that one of the biggest advocates for American empire was Theodore Roosevelt. He had been a secretary of the Navy to the Navy. Secretary of the Navy. And later on became president, of course. And we could say of Theodore Roosevelt that he was probably one of the, I'll just say biggest advocates for U.S. expansion. Right. Biggest advocates for U.S. expansion. But two very important authors kind of shaped America's kind of viewpoint on how it should approach the world. One was Frederick Jackson Turner. We'd actually talked about him previously, but he wrote in the 1890s the frontier thesis, which more or less stated that the West, again, kind of a point that we talked about up here previously, right? This idea of manifest destiny, but this idea of going westward was the core character of the United States. That, you know, to be American, you know, you really couldn't have an American identity without the West. Well, beginning in the 1890s, the West essentially was closed, right? That there was no more territory out west. We talked about this in the previous chapter. And instead, what should be the new frontier? And of course, the new frontier, that the frontier at home is closed and there's no more room left. Well, where should America expand beyond that? And of course, what Turner was inferring to was overseas territory. So again, kind of a continuation on Manifest Destiny, the frontier thesis being a publication that was written by Turner, more or less saying that the West was closed, time to look for a new frontier. Alfred T. Mahan, he was in the Navy. I forget exactly what his particular position in, but he wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which more or less stated to be a world power. You need to have what they called a deep water navy. You know, he had looked at the history of those who were world powers and came to the conclusion that you could only be a world power if you had a deep water navy. And what deep water means is that it could go well beyond the shores of one's country. So he had looked at countries like the Netherlands and Great Britain during the 17 and 1800s, and what they had in common was they had the most powerful navy in the world. And this really influenced the United States to embark on modernizing its navy and building a navy that could rival the rest of the world. It said that you had to have naval bases established around the world. Again, at this time, you know, most of these fleets are primarily fueled by coal, so you need coaling stations so that if the U.S. Navy needs to be active in China, it doesn't have to go all the way back to the U.S. It can have a coaling station somewhere overseas. It means that there needs to be some sort of canal construction so the U.S. or the Navy can travel quicker in order to spread U.S. influence. Of course, the proposed canal will eventually be right in this area, cutting across Central America. That was the idea. And you can see why a canal here would be important because, you know, let's say you had a U.S. Navy that was stationed here. You know, typically they would have to sail all the way around, right, South America in order to get to the Pacific Ocean to attend to any sort of emergency that they would otherwise need to attend to. And if there weren't any coaling stations in, you know, the Midway Islands or any of these other areas, well, then it would have to go all the way back just to refuel. That wouldn't make sense. Of course, this canal makes it easier so that the U.S. Navy could potentially respond to emergencies in a much quicker way. So all of these suggestions about building coaling stations and naval bases around the world and building canals so the United States can respond quicker, all has to do with this idea that in order to become a world power, the United States needs to be able to exert its influence much further beyond its borders. And Mahan was incredibly influential in politics. The Naval Act of 1890 more or less modernized the U.S. Navy. And, you know, by 1910, we'll say, the U.S. had the third most powerful Navy, right? Only Great Britain and Germany could really rival it, with other countries like Japan kind of hot on their heels. But, you know, to go from a nation during the Civil War, which was considered an afterthought militarily, to having the third most powerful Navy in the entire world really meant the United States had risen to become one of the premier military powers of the globe. And soon you saw Mahan's, you know, suggestions go into action. You know, Hawaii was one of these islands that had long been kind of on the radar of the United States. Hawaii is incredibly important strategically, both for the economy and military, because it was kind of a halfway point between the U.S. and Asia. If the U.S. was going to have any hopes of you know, influencing Asia, whether that was trade or protecting its interests, you know, Hawaii was like the perfect area that was there. On top of it, Hawaii itself was rich in natural resources. It was a good place to grow sugar. In fact, U.S. sugar planters had been in Hawaii, approximately since the 1830s. So the U.S. already had a pretty strong economic influence there. However, as more and more Americans arrived, and in fact in Hawaii, the actual number of Americans was pretty low. It was American business owners. So by the time you get to the 1880s, 1890s, it's something like 70% of all the land in Hawaii is bought and purchased by the United States. And because the U.S. has such a strong business presence there, the Hawaiian government is also heavily influenced by these American businesses, often at the expense of the native Hawaiians. Queen Liliuokalani really protested U.S. occupation, or influence might be, on behalf of the native Hawaiian population. So she spoke out against kind of the American business interest there, but because it was a highly sought after territory, and because there were economic interests in Hawaii, American economic interests in Hawaii, trying to get sugar to the United States cheaper, in the late 1800s, an armed revolt by U.S. planters succeeded in arresting the Queen of Hawaii. And after 5 years or so of really questioning who is in control in Hawaii, the United States moved to annex it in 1898, primarily for military purposes. That was the final sort of push. And just like that, in 1898, Hawaii became a U.S. territory, U.S. possession. There's a similar story that goes on in Samoa, the Samoan Islands, somewhere around here. I want to say maybe right there. But again, important because of their strategic location, close to Asia, close to Australia. Samoa was a little bit different in that you had two other nations, Germany and Great Britain. But pretty much Germany, Great Britain, and the U.S. all agreed. Here's a picture of the Queen of Hawaii, actually. All agreed to split Samoa between them. Again, we're dealing with the three largest military powers on the planet, and this time they all agreed to work together at the expense of the native Samoan population there, who, much like the Queen in Hawaii, was not all that thrilled with the new sort of role that outsider foreign presence would have in that area.